Jason J. Cooke, 1821 to 1905, was an Ohio-born banker and financier who, more than any other figure, was responsible for raising the necessary funds for the Northern effort to win the Civil War. Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon P. Chase, had no success convincing New York bankers to purchase federal debt to finance the war. Chase named Cooke as a special agent for the sale of what were called 520 bonds in October 1862. The bonds were redeemable for gold in 5 years, or if held till maturity at 20 years, they earned 6%. Cooke ingeniously bypassed the New York banks by selling the bonds through newspaper advertisements and traveling sales agents who sold them to the general public. Over 2,500 of Cooke's agents traversed the northern states selling the 520s from 1862 to 64. Cooke himself was responsible for collecting over 1/4 of the Union's total war expenditure through the sale of over $361,000 in bonds. The Cooke and Company investment houses in Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. alone generated vast amounts of commissions on the sale of those federal bonds, and the Cookes exerted vast influence on banking policy long after the victory. In the postbellum era, Cooke played an influential role in the formation of the national banking system, the forerunner of the Federal Reserve that lasted from 1863 to 1913. This banking reform replaced the old system of state banknotes with national banknotes held in reserve at what were called bankers' banks. J. Cooke and his lobbyist brother Henry played a central role in winning congressional and public approval for the National Banking Acts of 1863 and 64 by equating national banknotes with unity and union while deriding state banknotes as artifacts of states' rights and succession. The brothers also orchestrated a letter-writing campaign in friendly newspapers, those that they had placed advertisements for the 520 bonds, to create the illusion of broad public support for the banking reform. In his article, The Origins of the National Banking System, The Chase-Cooke Connection in the New York City Banks, Patrick Newman describes the unique relationship that allowed Secretary Chase and J. Cooke to lobby for passage of the new banking system. Newman notes that Cooke was as much or more motivated by self-interest as by patriotism. It was a true convergence of the common good and the entrepreneurial spirit. Cooke realized that he could easily sell the public debt more easily under the new monetary system because, quote, national banks had to purchase federal bonds if they wished to issue national banknotes, end quote. He won the support of recalcitrant New York banks for the banking system reform by providing an amendment to the 1864 Act, in which national banks in other large American cities could count any deposits they had in New York banks as reserves. And it set up a 3-tiered banking system, one with smaller country banks. Secondly, they had large city national banks. And finally, you had the reserve banks in New York City. While creating a nationwide banking system, the concentration of reserves in New York banks, which was the center of financial speculation, it would prove to be a recipe for systemic failure. After the war, Cooke not only set up the national banks, but created and issued bonds through them. The passage of the act hastened the end of state banknotes with national bank ones, especially after the inclusion of a 10% tax on state notes. The Cookes became the second largest shareholder in the First National Bank of Philadelphia. At first, Cooke was reluctant to speculate and issue bonds in the great railroad boom of the postbellum period. He issued bonds for the Northern Pacific Railway finally, and intended to connect Washington State and Oregon with St. Paul, Minnesota, traversing through Yellowstone Park. Cooke organized a huge public offering, and he took no support from the established banks or government subsidies. He raised $13.5 million from the public, but the railway only laid track to Bismarck, North Dakota, thanks to the rocky terrain and military battles against the Native American Sioux tribes. As the railway neared bankruptcy, Cooke covered the losses with money from his own finances and his shares. When a liquidity crisis hit Europe in 1873, starting in Vienna, a string of bank failures spread to the U.S., and Cooke's own National Bank in New York failed. A 6-year-long depression began, and Cooke was driven into bankruptcy. He was forced to liquidate his investment houses in Philadelphia, New York, Washington, and London. And although he was able to eventually pay off his debts through his investments in a Utah gold mine, Cooke never regained his stature as a preeminent American financier. But despite it all, his influence had a lasting effect on the development of a great nation. The Union survived. His banking system set the stage for the introduction of the Federal Reserve System that we have today, and the railroad he championed and lost his fortune on, the Northern Pacific, was finally completed in 1883 under new ownership. It was J. Cooke's risk-taking, his patriotism, and entrepreneurial spirit that forged much of the progress of late 19th century America. Thank you.